Welcome to episode 12 of The Evidence Room. Inside every investigation, the truth is hidden in the evidence. Tonight, we explore one of Mexico's most disturbing and complex criminal mysteries.
Yeah, we are doing a deep dive into Ciudad Juárez, starting around 1993. It's a really heavy topic, but so crucial to understand.
It really is. And, we're looking way past those sensationalized serial killer headlines today. I
Exactly.
want to understand the sheer scale of the institutional failures that allowed the systematic disappearances and murders of young women in this city.
Right, because this isn't just your standard true crime narrative. It is this profound intersection of global economics, deeply entrenched gender roles, and honestly, total state collapse.
Yeah, it exposes exactly how sudden societal shifts can have deadly consequences when they aren't anchored by a functioning, accountable justice system.
Absolutely. So to understand the mechanism behind these crimes, we have to look at the exact moment Juarez was economically rewired.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're talking about 1994, right?
Yes. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, goes into effect, and suddenly the border sees this absolute explosion of maquiladoras.
Those are the massive foreign-owned assembly plants, right?
Exactly. And they needed cheap labor, and they needed it immediately. So this drew tens of thousands of young women from rural villages across Mexico and even Central America.
Which, that creates a sudden, unprecedented demographic shift overnight.
Right.
You suddenly have this massive population of independent, mobile, but highly vulnerable female workers.
Yeah, and to understand why this became so dangerous, you have to look at the psychological friction this caused within the local culture.
The shifting gender roles.
Historically, traditional societal dynamics there leaned on two core concepts. You have machismo, characterized by male dominance and power, and then marianismo, which defines female subordination and domesticity.
So NAFTA basically detonates those traditional roles.
Basically, yeah.
Because men in the region are facing high unemployment, they're losing their historic status as the sole breadwinners. Meanwhile, these young women are gaining financial autonomy.
Right, they are leaving the domestic sphere, stepping onto the factory floor, and cashing their own paychecks. It wasn't just that women were working, it was that they were suddenly the primary economic engines.
Right.
And in a culture where a man's worth had long been tied to his financial dominance, it created this devastating power vacuum in the home.
That makes a lot of sense. It generates these incredibly dangerous, simmering resentments among disenfranchised men.
Exactly. Women stepping out of their prescribed roles were viewed subconsciously or even consciously as targets who needed to be put back in their place.
It's like building this massive industrial machine, but completely forgetting to build the safety rails. The economic boom outpaced basic public safety by light years.
Oh, without a doubt.
Imagine you are one of these young women. You've moved hundreds of miles from your family for this promised factory job, but your new neighborhood has unpaved roads. There are absolutely no streetlights.
No infrastructure at all.
Right. Public transit is unreliable. So you are forced to walk miles to and from your factory bus in the pitch black through these empty desert lots simply to get to work.
The city inadvertently engineered a hunting ground. The lack of infrastructure combined with a population of isolated young women created perfect conditions for predators.
And by 1993, a terrifying, undeniable pattern begins to emerge.
Right, and the sheer volume is staggering.
We are talking about over 370 women, with some estimates pushing well past 500 killed between 1993 and 2011.
Yeah, and the victim profile was chillingly specific.
They weren't just random cross-sections of the population.
Not at all. The victims were predominantly young, usually between 15 and 25 years old. They were slim, dark-skinned, and almost entirely maquiladora workers or students from low-income backgrounds.
What's really fascinating, disturbing really, is how this violence is categorized.
Right, there were essentially two distinct types of violence occurring simultaneously. First, you had intimate femicide, which accounted for roughly 30% of the murders.
So women killed by domestic partners, ex-boyfriends, family members.
A direct, violent reaction to those shifting gender dynamics we just discussed. But the remaining percentage fell into a different, deeply disturbing category, which is systematic sexual femicide.
And this is where the true terror of Juarez really lies.
Yeah.
We were talking about stranger kidnappings, extreme sexual violence, torture, mutilation, and then just disposing of the victims' bodies like trash in the remote desert or in raw sewage ditches.
It's horrific. And what is critical to understand is how the state managed to hide the true scale of the systematic violence from the public for so long.
Right, because it wasn't just incompetence.
No, it was baked into the legal framework. At the time, the Mexican Penal Code restricted the legal definition of rape strictly to penile penetration.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying the system was fundamentally designed to reclassify gruesome torture as a lesser offense?
Yes.
Because I know there were horrific sexual violations involving foreign objects found on these victims.
Yeah, exactly. Because of that archaic definition, those specific horrific violations were legally downgraded to just sexual abuse.
You have to be kidding me.
I wish I was. And sexual abuse carried far lighter sentences, I mean, sometimes just a few months to a couple of years, compared to the severe penalties mandated for rape.
That is a staggering loophole. It systematically sanitized the official statistics.
Absolutely. The government could point to the data and say, look, our rape statistics aren't that high, while actively ignoring the tortured bodies out in the desert.
The legal and social systems were actively conspiring to downplay the crisis.
But, they could only hide behind legal technicalities in the vastness of the desert for so long. Eventually, the sheer volume of victims became impossible to sweep under the rug.
Which brings us to November 2001. That discovery just shattered whatever complacency was left.
It really did.
Because up until this point, a single body would be found out in the remote hinterlands, and local authorities could kind of push it out of the public consciousness.
Right, but then they find the mass grave.
Exactly. The bodies of 8 young women were discovered in a mass grave in a cotton field, which was this vacant lot practically in the center of the city.
You simply cannot ignore 8 strangled, mutilated women found within hours of each other in the middle of town. It fundamentally changed the narrative.
And the victims found in that cotton field also broke the established mold just enough to command a different level of media attention.
Yeah, you had 17-year-old Laura Berenice, 14-year-old Esmeralda Herrera, and 19-year-old Guadalupe Luna.
And Guadalupe was an outlier, right? She wasn't a factory worker.
She was a business administration student from a relatively well-off, connected local family. Her mother, Celia de la Rosa, and her university classmates launched this massive vocal campaign that made Guadalupe a household name.
So the public is finally demanding answers.
Right. But the institutional response reveals a police force that is way more interested in managing optics than actually catching killers.
Oh, the victim blaming was just blatant.
Unbelievable. High-ranking officials literally went on record suggesting that these women provoked their own murders by wearing short skirts or walking alone at night or living so-called double lives.
Which is infuriating. It is completely contradicted by the physical evidence.
Exactly.
The forensic data from the scene showed that 74% of the victims were wearing long pants when their bodies were found.
Yep.
It was a complete fabrication by the state, just a desperate attempt to shift the blame onto the victims to mask their own failure.
And the irregularities went far beyond just bad public relations. The state's handling of the evidence was categorized as gross negligence.
Like what, specifically?
Well, police routinely misidentified corpses, handing the wrong remains back to grieving families.
Oh my.
Yeah. They left the crime scene unsecured, allowing evidence to be completely trampled. They failed to conduct proper autopsies or take basic semen analyses. Officers wouldn't even file written reports properly when families initially came in.
Think about what that means for a mother like Celia de la Rosa. You are fighting a system that isn't just failing to find your daughter's killer. It is actively covering up its own incompetence and gaslighting you in the press.
It creates an environment of total, unadulterated impunity.
Right. If you are a predator operating in Juarez, you see a police force that blames the victims, fumbles the DNA, and refuses to investigate. It is practically a green light to keep killing.
So faced with this sudden, intense international outrage over the cotton field discovery, the local police realized they needed a win fast.
They didn't do actual detective work.
No, they scrambled for convenient scapegoats.
Here's where it gets really interesting, in a very dark way. The police strategy looked less like an investigation and more like a macabre game of whack-a-mole.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
Every time public pressure reached a boiling point, authorities would magically arrest a new suspect, parade them in front of the cameras, extract a confession, and declare the crisis solved. Yet, the women kept disappearing.
And tracing the timeline of these suspects exposes the sheer absurdity of the police narrative. It starts back in 1995 with the highly publicized arrest of an Egyptian engineer named Sharif.
Right.
The police claimed he was the sole mastermind, this deranged serial killer. They locked him up. But the murders didn't stop. In fact, they escalated.
So the police pivot to explain away the new bodies. In 1996, they arrest a local street gang called Los Rebeldes.
Right.
And the official story this time, Sharif was somehow orchestrating and paying this gang from behind bars to keep killing women so he would look innocent.
It sounds like a bad movie plot.
It really does. And then 3 years later, in 1999, they arrest a group of bus drivers known as Los Toltecas.
And finally, right after the 8 bodies are found in the cotton field in 2001, within a mere 4 days, the police magically arrest 2 more bus drivers, El Cerrillo and the Foca.
Wow, 4 days.
Yep. Every single one of these arrests has been widely discredited by independent forensic experts. The linchpin of the state's cases always relied on confessions. But there is extensive documented evidence that these confessions were extracted through extreme torture.
Yeah, defense lawyers released horrific photos of the suspects showing their bodies covered in fresh cigarette burns.
Yeah.
Right? Including burns on their genitals, sustained while in police custody.
Yes.
And I have to point out, the state's explanation for that is wild. The police actually went on record claiming the suspects inflicted those burns on themselves after confessing out of some profound sense of guilt.
Yeah, that was their official stance.
That defies all basic human logic. And the confessions themselves were riddled with contradictions, matching none of the withheld crime scene details.
Exactly. And anyone inside the system who tried to call out this corruption was brutally silenced. Oscar Maynez, who was the chief forensic investigator for the state of Chihuahua, actually resigned in disgust.
Good for him.
He stated publicly that there was absolutely no physical evidence linking these bus drivers to the cotton field victims, and he refused direct orders from his superiors to plant evidence to frame them.
Honestly, resigning was probably the safest option. Look at Mario Escobedo.
Right.
He was the defense lawyer representing La Foca. He put together this brilliant, airtight defense, proving his client was tortured into confessing. And shortly after filing those motions, Escobedo was pursued by unmarked police cars in the dead of night, crashed his vehicle, and was shot dead by police officers.
And the official police story was that they mistook this prominent lawyer for a fugitive and claimed he shot first.
It's just so blatant. The chilling reality of this whack-a-mole justice system is that while the police are busy torturing bus drivers and assassinating defense attorneys, the actual perpetrators are completely free to keep hunting.
Whether they are individual serial killers, organized crime syndicates, wealthy elites operating with protection, or a mix of all three, they just kept going.
So as a citizen, what do you do when the local justice system is hopelessly, violently compromised?
Well, for the families and grassroots activists in Juarez, the answer was to bypass the Mexican government entirely and appeal directly to the international community.
The sheer bravery of the women in Juarez cannot be overstated.
Oh, it's incredible. Grassroots organizations formed out of pure, desperate necessity. In 1999, activists founded Casa Amiga, the city's very first rape crisis and sexual assault center.
Providing services the state literally refused to offer.
Exactly. You also had the powerful Ni Una Más movement, not one more. These mothers, sisters, and local activists marched, protested, and painted pink crosses on the telephone poles where women vanished.
They physically dragged these femicides into the global spotlight.
They did, and their relentless push eventually led to a monumental milestone in international law. In 2009, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights delivered its judgment in the Cottonfield case.
This wasn't just a slap on the wrist, right? This was a watershed moment.
Huge. For the first time in history, an international court utilized a gender perspective in its contextual analysis of a state's actions.
And using a gender perspective basically meant the court refused to look at these murders as isolated, random acts of violence.
Right. They examined the structural power imbalances, the societal discrimination, and the historical vulnerability of those maquiladora workers.
So the court issued this groundbreaking ruling. Mexico was internationally responsible not just for failing to properly investigate the murders, but for failing to prevent them in the first place.
That is a massive legal distinction.
The court essentially said that a government's willful ignorance of a specific demographic's vulnerability is legally equivalent to complicity.
Exactly. The state knew there was a generalized, escalating pattern of gender-based violence. They knew these young women were walking through unlit, unpoliced areas. Therefore, the court ruled the state had an obligation of strict due diligence to protect them.
And by failing to provide basic security and then failing to investigate, the state violated their fundamental human rights.
The court ordered what they called transformative reparations. They didn't just write a check to the families, they mandated structural changes.
Like immediate search protocols, right? Assuming a missing woman is in danger immediately, rather than waiting 72 hours and just shrugging and assuming she ran off with a boyfriend.
Yes. They ordered mandatory gender training for judges and police and the creation of a national DNA database.
But I have to ask, mandating DNA databases and training seminars sounds great on paper. But how do you actually enforce that against a police force that was just caught torturing bus drivers into false confessions?
Right.
How does a piece of paper from an international court dismantle a culture of impunity?
That is the tragic crux of the issue, really. The Cotton Field decision provided a comprehensive blueprint for how a state must respond to gender-based violence. It established new precedents worldwide.
But the gap between international legal rulings and the lived reality on the ground in Mexico remains a massive bleeding chasm.
Because looking at the data today, violence against women in Mexico remains critically high. Thousands of women are still murdered annually for reasons based strictly on their gender.
The legal framework improved on paper, and awareness is higher than ever, sure.
But dismantling a deeply entrenched culture of institutional impunity is incredibly difficult. Furthermore, the situation in Juárez and across Mexico has only become more complex over the last 2 decades.
Because of the cartels.
Right. The extreme escalation of cartel violence and organized crime has added new, heavily armed layers of brutality and misogyny. The cartels operate with the exact same impunity that the serial killers of the 90s enjoyed, often with the same state complicity.
It brings everything we've discussed into sharp focus. Violent crime on this massive systemic scale rarely happens in a vacuum. It requires a perfect storm of failures.
It really does.
You need the rapid economic exploitation of a vulnerable new workforce. You need the collision of shifting gender dynamics that threaten traditional power structures, creating a backlash of male resentment.
Yeah.
And perhaps most chillingly, you need a state apparatus that decides, whether consciously or through gross negligence, that certain citizens simply do not matter enough to protect.
The machinery of Ciudad Juárez was built purely for profit, prioritizing the movement of goods over the safety of the people assembling them. When the most vulnerable workers fell through the cracks, the system didn't just fail to catch them, it actively looked the other way.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over. We talked extensively about how the North American Free Trade Agreement radically transformed the border economy overnight. The influx of factories created the very vulnerabilities, the unlit streets, the isolated night shifts, the marginalized migrant workforce that predators exploited.
Right.
If international trade agreements can so profoundly alter the physical safety, the demographics, and the social fabric of an entire region, should global economic treaties legally be required to include binding human rights and local infrastructure provisions for the workers they impact?
It's a profound question about the true hidden costs of global commerce. Are multinational corporations responsible for the safety of the communities they transform?
Exactly. When you build the penthouse of global industry and flat out refuse to pour the foundation of public safety, it is always the most vulnerable who pay the price. Thanks for listening to The Evidence Room. If you enjoyed this episode, like and subscribe for more true crime investigations from around the world. Remember, some cases remain unsolved, but the evidence always tells a story.